Yes, I did.
What did you
Yeah.
think? I thought it was
The one with several episodes of it, right?
Yeah, it was new.
Public television.
That's right. Yeah.
Yeah, I didn't see every single episode, but I saw something on that. I thought it was fantastic.
Yeah.
They did a good job.
And also the Vietnamese side. Like when you listen, like, oh my God, we're all the same.
Living in Seattle, of course, there's quite a significant but still, she actually was researching the Vietnamese that came here after the war and getting their stories versus what she heard. She kept looking at that was very interesting.
I think this is the late life season.
I'm sure that, you know, we talk to one another.
Oh, this is like this night. Okay, it's like 30 seconds.
Okay, we're going to start very soon, like in 30 seconds. So grab a seat, please. A few seats in the front. They're going fast. Okay, well, welcome everyone. Thank you for coming out. My name is Tom Hundley. I'm the senior editor at the Pulitzer Center. And for those of you who don't know us, the Pulitzer Center is a journalism nonprofit, and we support international reporting projects that appear in almost every publication you can imagine, from the to the New Yorker to the Surfer's Journal. I mentioned the Surfer's Journal because our guest tonight is a surfer who's written a very good book on surfing. Before we get started, though, as I said, we're a nonprofit, and nonprofits need a certain kind of oxygen. And here to talk a bit about that is our development team, our entire development team, Julia.
Hi everyone. Thank you for coming tonight. I am Julia Kelmers. I'm the development manager here at the Pulitzer Center. We're very happy to have you all here. November and December are a really special time for us at the Pulitzer Center. We have a gift matching grant through the entirety of November and December, where all donations to the Pulitzer Center are doubled by Newsmatch, which is a national giving campaign for nonprofit news organizations. It's us with another 140 nonprofit news groups. So just consider giving us some support in order to do programming like this and to give grants to, to produce our stories and to do our outreach and education work. We really rely on that support from you all and also from other foundations. So thank you.
We have people way in the back. Just speak up.
Well, that was about the end of what I was going to say, but I hope you all in the back heard that just throughout November and December, all donations to the Pulitzer Center are doubled. So if you feel like giving, please visit us at our website. Thank you.
So I'm really delighted and honored that our guest tonight is our friend, our colleague, and grantee, Michael Scott Moore. By way of introduction, I'm going to read a little bit from the blurb on the back of the galley of his book. In January 2012, having covered a Somali pirate trial in Hamburg for Spiegel Online International, and funded by a grant from the Pulitzer Center on Crisis Reporting, Michael Scott Moore traveled to the Horn of Africa to write about piracy and ways to end it. In a terrible twist of fate, Moore himself was kidnapped and subsequently held captive by Somali pirates. as he was subjected to conditions that break even the strongest spirits: physical injury, starvation, isolation, terror. Moore's survival is a testament to his indomitable strength of mind. In September 2014, after 977 days, he walked free when his ransom was put together by the help of several U.S. and German institutions, friends, colleagues, and mostly his strong-willed mother. The book, a real copy of the book is on sale out there for a very good discount, and Mike will stick around and sign your copies if you buy one. Mike, I think a few introductory remarks and slides, and then we have a 10-minute video that we're going to show you, and then we're going to have a conversation.
Yeah, sounds good. Thank you, Tom. I don't know if this is on, but the yeah, terrific. So we're about to see a movie that will indicate exactly how strong-willed my mother is. So you'll get to know her too, which is nice. But I'm first just going to give you a quick introduction to what I did in Somalia on my reporting trip and how I got captured. Like Tom said, I went there in early 2012, but I'd been planning the trip for a long time. In particular, I'd been following a trial of 10 Somali pirates in Hamburg for most of 2011. And in January 2012, after finding some connections to the relevant part of Somalia to the trial through some people that I met there, I went with another journalist, a documentary maker named Ashwin Rahman, to central Somalia. Ashwin's a very good documentary maker, and he moves in and out of war zones regularly, and he had some experience in Somalia, so it seemed like a good idea to go with him. And we went to Galkayo, which is a town in the center of Somalia, a little bit close to Ethiopia, but not very close at all to the coast. But it was an interesting place for us to look at the effects, the economic effects of pirate ransoms on the Somali economy. And back then, the end of 2011, beginning of 2012, this was the peak of what you might call the Somali pirate problem. It's fallen off again in the meantime. From Galkayo, we went out to the coast, to Hobyo. Hobyo is a pirate town that you might actually have heard of. It is on the coast, and they launch missions from there and that sort of thing. And we met a pirate boss who looked like that in Ashwin's TV interview, and we talked to him for a little while. And then we came back from Hobyo and made it back to Galkayo very safely. We thought that was the dangerous part of the trip, and once it was over, we felt pretty good. And Ashwin decided to go to Mogadishu, which was a slight change in plan. It meant a trip to the airport to see him off. My flight to Nairobi wasn't going to go for another 2 days or so. And we saw him off. He got on the plane, no problem. And it was on the way back from the airport in the president's car, the president of that region in central Somalia, which is called Galmudug, that we got stopped along the side of the road back to our hotel by a technical, which looks like that. A technical is a battle wagon in the Somali Civil War. It's fairly common because the Civil War has been going on for over 20 years. This is just a sample photograph, but that technical aimed a cannon like that right through our windshield, overpowered my guard, who didn't even fire a shot, and about a dozen men came over from the flatbed of that truck to my side of the car and pulled me out and beat me with their weapons, broke my glasses, which I was wearing at the time, broke my wrist actually too, and then bundled me into an SUV that was waiting too, and we drove off into the Somali bush, which looked like that. And that was the beginning of a very long ordeal. I spent 2 years and 8 months in Somalia, and most of it was on land, so in the sort of arid desert bush like this, which is actually savanna. I met a Seychellois fisherman named Rolly Tambara. I got to be friends with him because we spent almost 8 months together. And also, I'll want to talk about this after the film. I was held for about 5 or 6 months on a ship. The same pirate gang had captured a tuna vessel called the Naham 3, and this is a picture of the actual vessel, and anchored it off Hobyo. And at some point, the pirates decided to put Rolly and me, the other hostage, on board this ship. And we spent the summer of 2012 living with the captive crew of this ship. So that's one reason the book is called The Desert and the Sea, because I was held on land but also on water. I think right after I got captured, there was a very sort of smart hot take in Slate saying that I wasn't captured by pirates, technically, because I was captured on land. I resisted the urge to comment on that. But now the book is out, and so I can say that, in fact, I was captured by pirates, and they proved it by putting me on a ship. As it turns out, I'm probably the only Western writer, the only Western journalist to see life on board a ship captured by Somali pirates. So it's an important part of the book, and it's a part of the story I don't talk about as much as I'd like to in public. The other aspect of the story, of course, is the effect that... So first of all, I'm just happy to be alive. I'm glad I got out of there with my life. That wasn't a clear or sure thing towards the end. And the effect that stories like this have at home is also very important to talk about. And so that's what the film is going to be about. It's about slightly over 10 minutes long, and it was made for the New York Times Octoc section. It's a short documentary. Okay, we can start that, I think.
I was captured in January 2012 by pirates and held for more than 2.5 years. I was held in the bush, out in the open, also on a fishing boat for 5 months on the water with other hostages, and then alone, essentially in a solitary confinement, in a series of prison houses in a town in central Somalia called Galkayo.
What's your nationality?
I'm American and I'm German.
Because of that? American and German?
Yes.
You have two passports?
2 passports, yeah.
First attempt, when you arrived here?
I arrived here in early January.
Eh?
January 6th in Somalia.
Okay, then what do you requesting for the government?
I have to request from the American or the German government the full ransom.
Then how do you want it to be?
They need to give an answer within 3 days, and if there's no answer to payment of the ransom within 3 days, then the kidnappers here will sell me to Al-Shabaab.
Our panel tonight is on freelancer safety. Michael Scott Moore. He's a Pulitzer Center grantee, a journalist, and a novelist. He also, unfortunately, was kidnapped while reporting in Somalia and held captive there for 2 years and 8 months. But in the vein of responsibility, and this is sort of a question for me and for Michael, many people feel it's our fault that, in my case, I acted recklessly by going to this Taliban interview, that you were reckless for going to Somalia, and that's a problem. And I regret my decision to go to an interview that got me abducted, and not in terms of your case specifically, but do you hear about, or feel there's a change in terms of journalists themselves? Are people recognizing how much more dangerous the environment is?
It wasn't totally clear how dangerous Syria was until it became clear how many hostages there were. And that's one drawback to keeping hostage cases quiet, actually, which, yours was kept quiet, mine was kept quiet while they were still going on. And I think a lot of the cases in Syria were kept quiet to the point where other journalists didn't know what they were getting into. So slowly, just because of the horrors that have come out of Syria, people are, in general, probably trying to be a bit more careful, but that doesn't mean that the general culture of freelance journalism has changed, no.
Before you leave on a trip like this, you have to think that in the worst case scenario, you're actually going to be putting your family in contact with some really unsavory people. And that haunted me in Somalia. That's not something I ever wanted to do. So no story is worth your life. That's just a hard and fast rule. And almost no story is worth getting kidnapped for. In fact, I can't think of one that is.
Last night, militants from the Islamic State group released a horrific video showing James Foley being beheaded. It's too graphic to show.
It was around the 20th of August. I was keeping pretty good track of the date at that point. There was news this morning on the radio that about Jim Foley, an American journalist who was decapitated by IS in the Syrian desert. Horrifying. I can barely imagine what my family's going through.
From time to time, I did go down to the ocean, and knowing that he loved to surf, and I would do that. And in the evening, when I would look at the moon, I would always think, well, he must see the same moon, and I hope, he feels that I'm thinking of him, and that maybe he gets a little strength from that, and to cope for another day, another week.
While I was there, I thought it would be a perfectly good idea for a special forces team to come and get me, especially after I was there for 2 years. I mean, I simply had no other sense of hope because I didn't feel like there was any progress with negotiations. It was always hard to gauge what was going on behind the scenes. And after a year or so, I wasn't sure I wanted to live anymore. So that risk of of dying during a rescue seemed a lot less intense to me. And that's still the official American position, is that we don't negotiate. If anything, we rescue. And as long as you're not going to negotiate, you should rescue.
What's true, I think that there were red lines that I set for myself, and a few of those I crossed. I went shopping for insurance, and when I got rejected shortly beforehand, I should have just called off the trip. We're here because 26 men that I was held hostage with are just getting out of captivity, and actually I'm terribly excited. They were the fishermen who I was held with on the Naham 3, the fishing boat that was captured in 2012. And they're the last large single crew that's being held by Somali pirates. And they've been in captivity for 4.5 years, which is extremely frustrating because I was hoping and working for their freedom as soon as I got out, and it's painful to think how long they've been there. On the last day, a car came, and they told me to pack my things.
and they had a sack of cash. It was part of a ransom that was paid, and that particular sack was payment for the guards, apparently. And then I realized, that what the pirates were saying was real. Before that, I was very much on my guard. I wasn't allowing myself to believe them or to be hopeful, because they'd been telling me for months that I was going to get out in a couple of weeks or a couple of days or something. I'd learned not to believe them.
We came up with an agreement and everything. I mean, we made our demands when Michael would be brought and how he would be picked up, etc., etc. And there must have been some kind of rift, because when the ransom was being distributed, they had a big gunfight, some of the top pirates, and amongst each other. But luckily, Michael was out of there by then.
I landed in Nairobi, and this is the first place I felt comfortable, at least for a little while after you get out. And it marks a change in your life. I had my own bed, and I had my own shower. I mean, a working shower for the first time in 2.5 years. It was all mine. I could just sleep in the bed and then take a shower when I wanted to, instead of having 6 guys get up with Kalashnikovs to guard my way.
When we met, his first words were, "I'm so sorry to put you through this," So I said, "Well, it's okay. You're free. Don't be sorry."
I contributed money to their release. As soon as I got out and I heard they were still in there, because there was just no other way to get them out. I could kind of tell that there were, out of 5 governments, nobody was planning any kind of a rescue. So the only way those guys were going to get out of Somalia was going to be with money.
When they all noticed that I was there, it was just pandemonium. It was really wonderful. It was obvious they hadn't forgotten about me, and it was really important for me to be there to show them that I hadn't forgotten about them.
In general, going to crisis regions like this is still something that has to be done. I mean, otherwise you don't get a clear picture of what's going on. That's a responsibility that journalists has to take, and it was a complete failure from my point of view. There will always be journalists who take risks like this. But it's I'm going to be living with the consequences for the rest of my life of what happened, so.
So I'm going to start with a couple of questions.
Put your data to work on.
A couple of questions, and then I'm going to open it up to you. You've written a very compelling, powerful book, but it's not the book that every journalist wants to write. Nobody wants to be a hostage for 977 days. Can you tell us a little bit how you approached the task of putting this book together?
Well, the first thing I had to do when I got out was debrief with the FBI. So, in some sense, for the first 3 weeks when I got back to Berlin, I told the story once, and then I took it easy for a while. And then I started to approach actually writing it. First I wrote an article that eventually got published in The Guardian as a long read, which was a sort of summary of what went on. And that was how I had to approach it. I had to approach it sort of piecemeal. And even when I wrote that article and when I wrote a draft of the book, I had to write it in layers. It was easy enough to remember what had happened in Somalia, but it wasn't necessarily easy to explain how it felt. So first I wrote the events, and then I went back and sort of added the emotion and other aspects that needed to be folded in. It had to happen in layers like that.
So aside from coping with the physical misery and deprivation of your circumstance, it would seem to me that the most difficult thing to overcome is what's going on in your head while you're in captivity. Mm-hmm. The fear, despair, depression, thoughts of suicide.
Yeah.
How did you manage that?
Well, it was a question of figuring out how to keep your mind occupied with something else during the day. So for part of every day, I went through, and I actually wrote in my head. So if I didn't have a pen and paper, I would go through books that I knew I had left at home, sort of unfinished, and revised them in my head and composed whole paragraphs in my head. And then I had 2 hours worth of things to recite every morning to myself and memorize. And that helped keep my mind focused and occupied, focused on something else. And then I had horrible hours to myself, and then sometimes I could do yoga, which definitely helped regulate my emotions. And then I had to sleep, and that didn't always go so well either. But it was a question of focusing your mind on something else.
I recall reading other hostage stories. Jerry Levin, who was a CNN hostage, he knew entire operas.
Yeah.
and others have recreated baseball games,
right.
inning by inning. I mean,
Right.
it's hard to imagine. They let you have notebooks. I mean,
Yeah.
you took notes.
Yeah, I did, and then I had my notes confiscated a couple of times. So the first time I got my hands on a notebook, obviously, it was early on in my captivity, so obviously I was thinking, well, I want to take down everything, because when I get out, I want to write a book. So I kept a journal, and they confiscated that. And then the second time they confiscated my notes, which was after the experience on the ship, I realized that they were worried about what I would write about them. So the guards themselves didn't like the fact that I was writing about the guards. So the third time I got my hands on notebooks and some pens, I made a deliberate decision to write not about what was going on. And so I drafted a novel. And if something important happened, I put it in the corner in German or whatever, but I didn't keep a regular journal. And being able to focus on something that was not Somalia in a novel that I had no idea, I assumed the notebooks would get confiscated. That also helped.
So where's the novel?
Well, exactly. Because I wasn't writing about the guards, I was allowed to leave with 6 notebooks. So I've got a draft of that novel.
One thing that really surprised me, I think we spoke about this soon after you got out, and then it's also in the book, but you actually had some leverage over the guys who were guarding you. I was amazed.
You mean with a hunger strike?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I learned that maybe after a year or so, because at some point in early 2013, they decided to put chains on my feet when I slept. And one morning, because I think as a direct result of the fact that I'd thrown the keys to the chains down the toilet, they came in later anyway and found new locks and put them on my feet. And then in the morning, I expected them to come in and unlock the chains, but of course they didn't, because they suspected me of having gotten rid of the keys in the first place. So to protest the fact that I was still wearing chains during the day, I mounted a hunger strike, and I was surprised by how quickly the guards panicked. It meant that I had for the first time, I felt I had some sort of power over them. So I learned to use hunger strikes as a way to make sure that at least I got fed in the morning, for example.
Do you want to talk about the Nahum 3?
Yeah, the Nahum 3 was, I mean, you see how important the experience was. We lived together for 5.5 months. And after I got taken off the ship, I tried to escape from the ship, so I jumped. And after that, the pirates actually brought me on land. And after that, I didn't see any of the hostages again. Not Rowley, who was placed on the ship with me, and not any of the crew who were hostage on the ship. And they were all these guys from East Asia, who I got to know pretty well. And that part of my captivity was easily the most interesting, because there were so many friends, first of all, and also the food wasn't bad. It was a Taiwanese ship, so the food that came out of the kitchen was reasonably good Chinese food, basically, which we ate with chopsticks. And sometimes we caught fresh fish from over the side, and sometimes we actually took a big frozen tuna from the freezer hold and sliced that up with a power saw. So the food was much better than the stuff that we got on land. And so that whole experience, you're out on the ocean under the sun, was far better than being in a prison house on land. And I hope to see some of those guys again. Now that they're out, I'd like to go visit them.
Questions?
Yeah.
I think we passed the microphone around.
Hi, I'm curious why the Navy SEALs rescued that woman, Jessica, was it?
Jessica Buchanan, yeah.
Yeah, and not you.
Yeah, that's an important aspect of the story, actually. They rescued her 4 days after I was captured. So there might have been some connection to my capture and something that triggered the rescue operation. I don't know what it is. I've heard a rumor that maybe they thought I was there in the same camp. I was about 100 miles away. It was definitely the same region, but I don't think that I'm ever going to learn exactly why. You know, the operating story is that she was sick, and she did have, I think, a kidney problem that she developed. So they went in and got her for that reason. I don't know. Afterwards, I think the pirates, they demanded $20 million, and I think they clung to that demand for a long time because of that rescue, because some Somalis died who at least had a clan relationship to my group. It wasn't the same group, but it was not unrelated. Why SEALs didn't come in, you know, within that 2.5 year span, I don't know. I'm sure there had to be plans on the shelf or something like that. But I think in an operation like that, everything has to line up, and of course it has to be safe for the operators, and the intelligence has to be straight. So if there's any doubt, then it doesn't get signed off on. It's a good question, though.
What else?
We spoke earlier that we plan on cruising in that
Yeah.
region
Yeah.
on our yacht. We'll take all the proper precautions, but what if? What was your relationship with your captors, with the Somalis, that helped you get through the 2.5 years?
Well, I don't recommend getting captured.
Well,
so,
agree.
Stick to those naval corridors that the Navy has corridors where shipping generally can go safely. The pirates that I got to know, the pirates who were willing to talk to me a little bit in English, and I could mix some Somali, and we could sort of talk in a pidgin that we developed. No, I mean, they were okay. You could tell that underneath there was humanity, and we had these very stark roles to play, but under other circumstances, I certainly could have been friends with a few of them. Not all of them. Some of them didn't even want to hear Somali from me, so it was a question of personality. But the culture is very different. I mean, I actually got all my guards. First of all, were religious, and I thought that was almost offensive to watch at first. These men going off to pray 5 times a day while I was sitting there as a hostage. And eventually one of the guards told me, one of the guards that I was friendly with, told me that there was, that his excuse for that, his justification was actually Islamic. And he said, well, it's okay to hold you hostage because you're an infidel. We can take money from your family because you're not Muslims. I've traveled in other Muslim countries before. That's not a very common attitude. But Somalia is provincial enough that some people can go for that. And I think that's something that the guards were told. So there are very serious cultural divides there that you can suffer from.
Well, one of your captors became your Facebook friend. Want to tell us a little about that gentleman?
Right. He's described in the book. He's not exactly a Facebook friend. He messaged me through Facebook, and without becoming friends, we kept this conversation going for a little while. And his name was Mohammed Talil. Is Mohammed Talil? He was one of my guards, and actually one of the gentler guards, one of the guys that I could talk to, as a matter of fact. And he wrote to me afterwards and sort of cast his role in a slightly different way and tried to say, well, I'm sorry about what happened and everything like that. And he actually helped. I verified a few facts with him while I was writing the book, so that helped. In the meantime, he's under arrest. He's in jail for being part of my captivity, and there was just a piece in the New York Times about it on Friday. Because he was so gentle, I don't feel vengeful towards him. It's not like I'm happy that he's in jail exactly, but it's a long story, and there's more to. There will be more to say later. Let's put it that way.
In that light, it might be useful to talk a little bit about the pirates' business model and how that works, and how ransoms get divided up, who has to be paid.
Right. Well, a pirate gang breaks up into different cells, and so Muhammad would have belonged to a guard cell, and there would have been other cells that deliver the food or deliver the cut, which is a drug that all pirates seem to like to chew. It's a leafy sort of drug, and all these different corners of the gang have different jobs, and they don't necessarily talk to each other. They're part of a very serious organized crime ring, and I think even the bosses who invest in a case like this need to get loans from outside. So by the time a hostage goes free, there are debtors who have to be paid. And there are debts for the cut that the guards have to pay. They sit there and they chew cut every day just to pass the time. And they're addicted to this stuff, so they wind up owing quite a lot of money to the bosses for providing this cut. So once a hostage goes out, there are lots of debts to be settled. And everyone needs to be paid in some way. And inevitably there's going to be disagreements about where the money should go. And this disagreement among the top bosses 2 days after I left resulted in gunfire, and so 5 of the bosses actually killed each other.
Well, there are no words to say how incredible it is that you were able to go through this
and get out, yes.
And get out, yeah.
Thank you.
I've had some experience with families of people who've been taken hostage in another part of the world. And in that case, there is pressure usually from the U.S. government against those families, even trying to get a ransom or finding other ways to get the person out. So to what extent in your situation were there impediments in other alternative methods to try to get you out, and were there differences between U.S. and Germany? Anything you can speak of on that?
Yeah, it's so my mom never heard any sort of warnings from the U.S. government about that. I know the Foley family did. That's a slightly famous case, but when Jim Foley was still alive as a hostage, there was a warning that came from, I think, the Obama Security Council, saying, well, if you pay this money, you could be liable for material support to terrorism. Later, the person who delivered that warning took early retirement. And when Obama announced his shift in hostage policy in 2015, I was here for that actually. There were people at all the tables talking to families saying that's never been American policy, and that's not really what the Obama government meant to say to the Foleys. So the problem is that all these things are complicated and fuzzy, and people get ideas into their head. It's true that if you pay a ransom to a terrorist group, you're financing the terrorist group. And in my case, it was a criminal group. It wasn't classified as terrorism by the U.S. government. So the pirates only wanted money. They didn't want me for ideological reasons. And therefore, I think a lot of the information about the case flowed from the FBI to my mother a bit better. So my mom wasn't frustrated by the way the government treated her. And in fact, they gave her a lot of support while she was negotiating with the pirates.
But still, in your case, the FBI could not negotiate a ransom.
Right.
They could give it advice.
They could give advice, yeah. I was impressed by how much background support the U.S. government does offer families. So they were there for my mom. But no, they couldn't get on the phone, or they couldn't help pay the money or deliver the money or anything like that. So they could help with logistics and getting me out. There was a very professional pilot who came to get me at the end. You know, they can point to those people, but they can't actually get their hands dirty.
I think we had a question in
Yeah.
the back here.
I was wondering if you, and this is a complex question, but could speak a little bit about the roots of piracy in the region, and from a solution standpoint of whether it's international development or foreign policy, to address those kind of root causes before pirates become pirates.
Yeah, that's a great question, because those were the questions on my mind when I went to Somalia. I wanted to write a book about that, basically. So the cliche about piracy is that most of the men who take up Kalashnikovs and go out on the water are frustrated fishermen. That's not quite true, and I debunked that a little bit in my book. What is true is that the roots of Somali piracy are there in illegal fishing that goes on in the Indian Ocean. When Somalia lost its last strongman president, a bit like Gaddafi getting killed and overthrown and killed in Libya, there was a civil war and chaos in the country, which is still going on, which meant there was no more navy. Somalia wasn't organized enough for it to defend its own coastline, which meant a lot of foreign fishing boats came in and outright stole fish. And when Somali clans and regional sort of leaderships understood what was going on, they organized a few speedboats to go out with guns to stop the fishing ships for about 24 hours and say, do you have a license to fish? And the fishermen would say, what do you mean a license to fish? This is Somalia. No, you need a license to fish from this or that clan, you know. Well, okay, how much is a license? And after 24 hours, it would be settled. You know, the license would be $50,000, and the fishermen could go free, and they could fish and everything like that. So it was a gray area legally because there was no federal government giving out these licenses. But it was also a step towards hijacking. And it's how the Somalis learned that they could go out and get bigger ships. And of course, once they were capturing cargo ships or tankers, it was no longer about defending the coastline. But as soon as they captured those larger ships, Somalis were in the newspaper. And pirates were saying, well, we're just defending our coastline. So almost as soon as you or I heard about them, they were no longer disgruntled fishermen, you know, just trying to defend Somalia. The reasons are obviously poverty. What is true is that every pirate I met was a young kid who needed a job, but a pirate. What's more important for a pirate is skill with a weapon rather than skill on the water. And to develop that economy so that the kids can have jobs it's simply going to take a long time. The one reason it's so hard to establish a business and keep it going is that the way clans work in Somalia is that if somebody establishes something, then everyone needs to get a cut. And there's a lot of jealousy that springs up very quickly. So just for clan reasons, it's hard to get something going. And in fact, a pirate lord is nothing but a warlord, which in Somalia just means a businessman who has an armed team of men. That's how you have to do business in Somalia. So I went there with the awareness that America had started under similar circumstances. In other words, because of the Navigation Acts, we had a bunch of frustrated sailors sitting around who actually did take to piracy 300 years ago. This was before we were Americans, of course. They were subjects to the British Crown. But this is the golden age of piracy that we're talking about. And it was a very natural thing for seafarers, if they couldn't trade, to go out and be pirates. And we only grew out of that by becoming our own country. We grew out of that by first of all, revolting against the British, but also establishing business that we needed to defend. And the first mission of the US Navy, once we were assembled as a nation, was to go out and stop the piracy that was happening off the Barbary Coast. So some vague model of that was on my mind when I went to Somalia, because what Somalia needs is just stability and economic development. Yeah.
On the side of, as a journalist, what curiosities have you developed out of this process, out of what happened to you? You've surfed. You had this beautiful connection to water. You've had this somewhat harder connection to water. And has your understanding of piracy changed? You talked about the golden age of piracy, but kind of like human trafficking or slavery globally right now. People don't really have a grasp of what it looks like in the modern world. Have you done more reading and research into piracy globally? And how is your connection with water changed?
Yeah, no, my connection with water is still very good, because when I surf, it's therapeutic. So I like the water. I'm not afraid of it. And if anything, the water is one thing that ties all my books together. My books are very different from each other, but actually they have the water in common. But one thing so piracy is an endlessly fascinating subject, but one thing that I noticed when I got out in 2014, which is when the migration across the Mediterranean was happening. I noticed a similarity between what I had just gone through and some of the stories that those people were telling. Namely, so one thing the pirates fed me, especially when I was on land, was biscuits and mango juice. It's just always available for some reason. They had a connection for business and biscuits and mango juice. One Somali who came across East Africa and then eventually went to Libya and across the Mediterranean said to, I think, save the children, he was a teenager, once he was safe in Italy, that he had been detained in Sudan. So in other words, he paid some smugglers, and then the smugglers stopped him, got on the phone to his family and said, well, to keep Ismail moving, we need more money. I said, okay, that sounds familiar. The men drove SUVs, carried Kalashnikovs, and Ismail told a newspaper that while he was being detained in Sudan, held hostage in Sudan, all they would feed him was biscuits and mango juice. Which then led to another project, actually, with the Pulitzer Center, and eventually a feature for Business Week, where I proved that some of the financiers in charge of the migrant trail in East Africa, that was moving Somalis in particular, were former Somali pirates, former Somali pirate financiers. And that is enlightening, and you can only think about that in terms of, real economics if you get away from the idea that pirates are just frustrated fishermen. But that told me a very important thing. It told me I had been a trafficked person. So a hostage is a traffic by definition, because it's about holding a person for money. And so you're right, there's an enormous modern day shadow economy in not just prostitution, but also slavery and moving people or keeping people from moving. And in fact, the dysfunctional policy that the EU has that won't let the EU process people as, as a bloc, is what allows criminals like former pirates to make money off this traffic. So if they could get it together and be more sane in the EU, then we could take the business of human trafficking out of, or human migration, out of the traffickers' hands, which means out of, in some cases, out of pirates' hands. Yes?
The fishing vessel that you were held on, 150, 200 feet long, did anyone go looking for their ship?
Yeah, good question. Yeah, about 150 feet long, 50 meters, a tuna longliner, loaded with frozen tuna, so about 100 tons of tuna. And I think the owners were not dealing with the pirates very much when I was there, so I didn't see too much of that. The pirates kept trying to call people. They weren't getting very far. But I found it completely astonishing that the pirates didn't try to sell the tuna. If they had sold the tuna, even on some sort of tuna black market, I don't know if there is such a thing, they would have made more money than they eventually did from those guys. So there's something going on.
And the ransom value, 1.6 million.
Yeah.
That was arrived at how?
Well, my mom talked them down. The original demand was 20 million, and it took that long for the level to come down to something that, was close to what my mom eventually had in the fund. And I have to say the pirates blinked. So they were still demanding a couple of million, 2 or 3, when they suddenly came down in the fall of 2014. And I'm pretty sure that amount was a disappointment to them, which partially explains the shootout that happened.
I'm curious about the drones. Did you ever find out, because you are sleeping on a mat, shackled down to the floor basically, and you can hear drones above your head. Have you ever found out what was it?
Yeah, no, good question.
Were they spying actually, and were they learning something about you?
Almost certainly, yes. So she means that I heard drones quite a bit, especially while I was held in prison houses on land after the ship. But even before the ship, there were definite, very large surveillance planes that would fly overhead, probably Orions, and then occasional drones that we saw. So there was a lot of surveillance, and I know the Navy was looking for me. I'm pretty sure the Navy knew where I was most of the time, not all the time. So those drones we heard were real. They scared the bejesus out of the pirate guards. But we heard very weird sounds sometimes, and that means that the drones were coming down low enough intentionally, because you can observe a house from a long way away. You don't need to scare the guards. So when the guards were scared, I think it was on purpose. More than that, I don't know. Obviously, I've tried to ask people, but they know full well that I'm a journalist. So.
So I'm just curious, how did your mom make contact with the kidnappers, and how do you go about negotiating and then eventually paying the ransom with reasonable certainty that they will then honor their side of the deal?
Yeah, no, those were the two most sensitive parts of the negotiation, right? The beginning and the end. So at the beginning, the FBI came to my mother's door. They learned about it really quickly, I think because of Ashwin. They were at my mom's door within 12 hours, but they also came here. They also went, German officials also went to my family's place in Cologne and to my office in Berlin at Spiegel Online. And those were the 4 best guesses as to where a phone call would have gone. And if the pirates had not stolen my notes the moment I got captured, I probably would have called here, because I had a bunch of phone numbers. And after about a week of complete confusion, the pirates finally put a phone in my hand and said, "Call somebody." I said, "Well, give me my notes. I know who I should call." They're like, "No, call someone." So I called the only number I had in my head, which was my mother's, and that wound up putting her in the role of negotiating, with advice. She was surrounded by experts, but the way it happened was just slowly. I mean, the pirates were very erratic about negotiating too, so it actually went up and down instead of going smoothly towards some middle point. You know, they don't negotiate very rationally because they're used to dealing with ship owners who, after a certain point, just splash up for with their insurance because it doesn't make economic sense to have a whole lot of oil sit idle in the water for very long. That doesn't work with human beings. So at the very end, it's true, the ransom had to be delivered in cash, and someone had to trust that an hour or two later the pirates were going to bring me out to the airport. But that is also part of the pirates' business model. So in other words, they have tried to be pretty consistent about that, probably to keep to a minimum the violent rescue option. So as it turns out, at that final stage, once a ransom's been agreed to and then delivered, Somali pirates are generally pretty reliable among hostage takers.
Thank you so much for your interesting and thoughtful presentation. Somalia presumably has the longest coastline in Africa.
That's true.
And so does that make it difficult to track pirates and to locate prisons? And also, how did you cope with the heat? The Red Sea is supposed to be one of the hottest place on earth. I mean, how did you cope with the heat?
Yeah, I wasn't on the Red Sea at all. When we went out to Hobyo, I was on the Indian Ocean, and then on the ship, I was on the Indian Ocean. The heat was, the heat was serious. But there's also a monsoon season where, if anything, the temperatures go down because the water gets colder. So on the ship, at least, during that summer, during monsoon season, it was actually cold. But the heat in a prison house was pretty bad. You just got used to it. You had to suffer through it. The coastline is long, and there are international navies patrolling several miles off the coast the whole way. In fact, they enforce kind of a corridor for shipping from the bottom of Somalia all the way around the Horn, and then through the Gulf of Aden to the Red Sea. And I think they still patrol inland with those same planes that I heard. But I think, yeah, it's very difficult to look at everything because the pirates can camp just about anywhere. But I think they have maps. They keep very careful tabs on what's going on. But there was so piracy has come down in the last few years. But there was a flurry of new pirate attacks that took everybody by surprise in the spring of 2017. So, yeah, it's hard to keep track of.
I think we have time for another question. Yes. Two more questions.
Thank you. The people who finance these pirate operations, they must have some ties to land.
Mm-hmm.
Homes, families, bank accounts,
Yeah.
activities. Can't they track them down, just the intelligence and security operations to see who they are, how they operate, and where they move around?
I would think so. In fact, one story about the top boss in my case, the top financier, whose name is Mohammed Garfanji, is that he invested his money as a rule in real estate. So that probably means in Nairobi, maybe Dubai. You should be able to find who his fronts are, and see about the movement of money. But when the money goes there, it's in cash. The first place it goes probably is into accounts in the Hawala system, which is just a money transfer system in the Muslim world. It's like a very efficient Western Union. There are electronic accounts within that. It can be very simple, but there's also some electronic, it's almost like banking, but not quite. And once the money goes into the Hawala system, it's a little bit difficult to trace. You can move it from account to account before it goes into a real bank somewhere outside of Somalia. So I think that's when it gets difficult. But I don't know. If anybody knows where my ransom has gone, they haven't told me.
Sounds like this has been one of the defining experiences, if not the defining experience of your life.
Yeah, so far.
And how has it affected your interest or your ability to work on other projects? And what's next?
Well, the novel I mentioned that I started to draft in Somalia, I've developed, so I'm going to keep working on that. I mentioned that almost all my books have something to do with the ocean. That will probably continue to be true. The other thing I noticed after I finished this book is that almost every one of my books has something to do with freedom. And that was important to realize about myself. And that turns out to be a very persistent consideration. So even if I don't write about pirates for the rest of my life or Somalia, I have other ways to go.
Movie?
Well, I don't know. There's chit-chat.
I have a question, yeah. How do you know if they have any strategy who to kidnap? Why do you think they kidnapped you?
Yeah, I don't think it's a very thought-out strategy. They do research people, so I think they looked me up before they kidnapped me. But they probably looked both of us up. So in other words, when that truck was waiting for me by the side of the road, I think it had been waiting all morning, hoping to get both of us on the way to the airport, which means that somebody tipped off the pirates to when we were going to the airport and what our movements would be. Ashwin feels lucky that he didn't get captured, and the pirates asked more than once where my partner had gone, where the other journalist was. So I think they just wanted two foreigners, two foreign journalists, and they probably researched us both, but I don't think they strategized much further than that.
Did you ever find out if the president of that region in whose car you were traveling, whether he had been in on it, whether his people had tipped off and he had gotten a cut of the money?
I suspect so. I don't know for sure. He disappeared pretty quickly after that. His term was up that summer. And as far as I know, he moved to London. So if anyone has traced the money to him, I don't. Well, probably not with that much, but because it was disputed, because there was a gunfight. No, if anyone has traced the money to him, he should be easy to find. But as far as I know, they haven't, and at least not in any reliable way.
So we have come to the end of our time. The book is available. It's a very powerful, very compelling story. Michael has written it beautifully, and he will stick around and sign copies and answer any lingering questions you have.
I can do that.
Thank you very much for coming, and thank you, Michael, for sharing that.